How do the Rings of Power work?
With magic.
They're not battery powered.
Well, one has nunchucks, the other one has a bow staff.
We're in trouble already.
Yes, you are.
Okay guys, so if you've watched my last 3 reviews on this channel, it was basically me just making fun of Rings of Power. But in this video, I didn't want to do the whole, sarcastic review, oh, it's a masterpiece type thing, simply because this show is just way too boring for me to keep being sarcastic and trying to roast everything. It's just too boring, it's too thin, it's just shit.
You know, some people call that art. It's crap!
Like, I'm not even trying to hate, it's just shit. I'm supposed to be reviewing episode 4 right now, but the number of times I've watched episode 4 of Rings of Power and slept like 30 minutes in is so many times, to the point that I didn't even have any content to like roast. That's how bad the show is. So in this video, I'm not just going to roast the show and have some people be like, oh, you're just hating. I'm going to genuinely sit down and tell you why this show is terrible. Let's start with, first of all, the people who defend this show. They typically say, oh, well, it's fantasy, man. You know, you need to stop judging it so much. It's a great show. Bro, I don't know if you know this, but the Peter Jackson films are also fantasy. They are also fantasy. The Lord of the Rings trilogy is also fantasy. Heck, The Hobbit is not as great as The Lord of the Rings, but it's way better than this garbage that Amazon made. And I'm going to explain to you why. First of all, the first issue with this show is that the CGI looks great, and therefore, because the CGI looks great, Amazon thinks that they can have crazy good visuals. And the one thing I noticed about this show is that they think that if they keep saying complicated words and pronouncing them in a funny way, okay, not in a funny way, but they pronounce them in like a quote-unquote unique way, that they're going to sound sophisticated in, I swear the dialogue of this show is terrible, with cringy lines such as,
the sea is always right. The sea is always right.
the sea is always right. And some of the things that, God, some of the things like what Durin said.
A dog may bark at the moon, but he cannot bring it down.
They don't even have to write characters who talk like this. You can just talk like regular people. You remember, like in Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, when Gimli is on horseback and he's just talking about how people think that there are no dwarf women. He doesn't talk and use a lot of gibberish words. He just talks like a regular person. But the problem with this show is they think that, one, if you talk and you use all this thesaurus type language, that you're going to sound more sophisticated. These people who, the Amazon writers who made this show, think that because the show looks great, that this is a compensation for good storytelling, of which it is not. That is the first issue with this show. Just like in the MCU, people who liked Thor Love and Thunder, they like Thor Love and Thunder because it looks good. It's not that it's a good story. It's not a good story like the way Infinity War is, or the way Winter Soldier is told. You know, Civil War is so many well-told stories. And then you have this story that, yeah, the CGI is pretty good, and let me say, there are so many colors on screen, it's so shiny. Yeah, people think that, ooh, shiny is good, you know. So they start defending it and saying that this show is good. And you know that there's something better out there, especially Lord of the Rings. You've seen the trilogy. So why the hell would you think that this is actually a good series? Part 2 has to do with the characters. Look at something like the Fellowship of the Ring, that introduces you to the world of Lord of the Rings. You're introduced to Frodo, who he lives with, his friendship with Gandalf, and just the lifestyle of the Shire, and it's Bilbo's birthday. Stuff is happening, but it's not happening like a montage. Is that what you call it? A montage. Yeah, it's not happening like a montage. It's happening like real-time events. Like you see Frodo in the forest, then you see him get up, go to meet Gandalf. But how is it told in Rings of Power? It's narration. It begins with narration. Yeah, I know that the Lord of the Rings movies begin with narration, but Galadriel in the Lord of the Rings Fellowship is not our main character. Our main character is Frodo. Here, our main character is Galadriel, and then her story is told through, typically, like, narration. Yeah, until you get to the part where she's talking about her brother, but even her brother is unlikable. She's given like 5 minutes of screen time and then he disappears. That's like Bilbo being given 5 minutes of screen time and then disappearing, and then you expect to care about him. Anyway, the way the Fellowship introduces the Shire folk, the people like Samwise, the people like Peregrine Took, Gandalf, the way it introduces them is what makes us like them. But in Rings of Power, it's 1 minute narration, 1 minute Galadriel is a little girl, she's making a boat, she gets bullied, then her brothers, then suddenly her brother delivers a cringy line, then suddenly it's war, then he's dead. Like I didn't have any time to connect with anyone. Yeah, the way the characters are introduced is the most important thing. It's the setup to connecting with everyone. But instead, you start with Galadriel as a small child, then the brother comes in, then the war comes in, then she's an adult. Like in that literally happens in like a span of like 8 minutes of just the opening. Can you imagine if you watched Frodo from being introduced as a baby to as a teenager to this, then as a grown-up, and you're like, what the hell? Like the reason we care about Galadriel's story in Rings of Power is because she begins by wanting to revenge the brother, but we don't see Galadriel interacting with the brother as an adult. We see Galadriel interacting with the brother as a child. Yeah, so you'd think probably that you'd want to see their interaction, Galadriel as a child interacting with the brother. Then once you've bonded with that, then he dies, then we can have an emotional impact as the audience to continue watching her as she gets her revenge. But it's just told to you in passing in 8 minutes, then you're supposed to care about her because she's a strong, independent woman who don't need no man. It's the setup is so bad. Then number two in terms of the character work. So the first issue with Rings of Power is how they introduce the characters. Next up would have to be the fact that, yes, okay, fine, they tell you Sauron is the bad guy, but even Sauron as a bad guy, there is no setup. You're just told that they fought and then Sauron disappeared, and then Galadriel has been hunting him down, looking for him. So I don't have a character. Imagine if I've never watched Lord of the Rings before. So I'm like, you tell me that there's a bad guy I should be afraid of, but I've never seen his face. I don't know what he did because you didn't show me. You know, like in Fellowship, you see Sauron fighting and Isildur cuts his hand off. But here it's just, you're just told that there was a war and there was this dude called Sauron, then he disappeared. That's all you're told. That's literally all you're told. Everything happens off screen. Every decent detail happens off screen, and this is why the show is so awful. The characters are awful. The way they are set up is awful. The typical structure of a story typically involves 4 things. The way it's a typical story is typically written. You typically start with a likable character. That's the issue now. With Galadriel is a huge Karen. She's an ass. If you watch episode 3, as I did in one of my reviews, she gets saved by the Númenóreans and then she goes there to be an ass, to insult the queen to the point that she's put in prison. And you're telling me that this is not an ass? The typical character is supposed to be someone likable, like Frodo or Sam or Aragorn, you know, someone likable. And then that person goes on a journey. Now, here there is no journey. That's the other issue with the Rings of Power, is that there is no journey. And when I say journey, I don't mean climbing mountains looking for revenge. I mean moving from not knowing to knowing. You get, like, you know, like the way, let's say, like Karate Kid, you have this kid who is, let's say, being bullied, to him defending himself, to now being able to defend himself. You get like a journey, an arc. I think that's actually the right word, an arc. Yeah, so you have a character who goes on a certain journey, typically has an objective. So that's the second part of the structure, has an objective. Okay, fine, here we have Galadriel, right? The 4-act structure is called lock. So you typically have a lead who has an objective and then meets a conflict. So C, conflict. But in this show, where is the conflict typically? Where is the conflict? Where is the conflict? If you run it through your mind, all you see is 1 minute she's hunting for her brother, then the group she's with mutiny her, and then after that she goes to Gil-galad to be awarded, and then they're told to go back to Valinor. Then she jumps ship. Then after that, she gets saved. So where is the conflict? And when I say conflict, I mean conflict is typically something long term that is consciously oppressing the main character. For example, when Frodo has the ring in Fellowship, I like using Fellowship. When Frodo has the ring in Fellowship, he's constantly either being tempted to wear it, or he's constantly being hunted by the Black Riders, the Nine. Yeah, so it's that danger is always there, hunting him down. Now in Rings of Power, where is the imminent danger that is supposed to be hunting Galadriel all the time? It's not there. In episode 1, it's just boredom, because after she's mutinied, what happens? They go back, Gil-galad awards them, and then puts them on a boat back to Valinor, and then she jumps ship. In the second episode, she's on a raft, yes, but she's swimming, just keep swimming like Dory over here. And then after that, gets on a raft, gets saved. I mean, there's a little bit of a storm. Then after that, gets saved. First gets saved by Halbrand, then gets saved by Númenóreans, then goes to Númenor to act like an ass. Yeah, and then you have that cringy scene where she's riding a horse with her Halloween face. My goodness. So there is no conflict. If she's supposed to be our main character, there is no conflict. There is no conflict. To make it worse, if you want to see a group of characters that has very little conflict, look at the Harfoots. Number one, if you've watched Rings of Power all the way up to episode 8, what does the story of Harfoots have to do with the story of Galadriel? If Galadriel is the main character, what does Harfoots have to do with Galadriel? What does the quote-unquote stranger, since we already know who the stranger is, what does the stranger have to do with? You get my point? That's the other issue with this show, that storylines happen everywhere, and then some of them are not connected. Like in episode 1, you see this part about a wolf, or is it hunting or is it stalking the Harfoots? Then it just disappears. Nothing happens with it. There are just a bunch of storylines going everywhere. Some intertwine, some end, some don't end, some don't have a payoff. That's my issue, and that's why so many people dislike this stuff. If you look at the way the Jackson films are directed and the way they play out, they are so, even a dum-dum can understand what is going on. Bilbo is tired of being in the Shire. He wants like a vacation. He tells everyone, I'm leaving now. Gandalf tells him, leave the ring behind. Gandalf does some research on the ring, discovers that the ring is bad, gives it to Frodo. Frodo is told by Gandalf, you've been snitched on by Smeagol, and then he has to leave the Shire. Then Sam must join him, then Peregrine Took, and then after that the ring, the danger that I was talking about, the conflict that I was talking about comes in. They have to meet Gandalf. It moves in such a nice, straight, cohesive line. Yeah, and as new characters are introduced in, when you start meeting Arwen, and you start meeting Arwen's dad, and you start meeting the Fellowship, everything is moving in nice. And I know some people are going to be like, well, you can't write a movie like a series, but you can actually. If I believe that if you could make like the Peter Jackson movies, yeah, they are like one movie is 4 hours, right? So that would be like 4 episodes. That literally would be like 4 episodes. 2 movies, 2 Towers, Extended Edition, and Fellowship would just be season 1. And everyone would be standing up on their feet to applaud that, yeah. But instead, you get this terrible show that, as I said, number 1, lacks a likable character. Number 2, has no objective, because, yeah, sure, it's about avenging the brother, but even the person that we are avenging here, I don't know who this character is, because the entire show you keep wondering, who is Sauron? And then the end, they just show you, oh, it's Halbrand, and you're like, oh, okay. Worst reveal ever, and so anticlimactic. Yeah. And then the fourth part of the act is supposed to be knockout. This is like a very simple structure of how to write a story. So knockout is typically where the character and the danger finally meet up with each other. So for example, that would be like in the trilogy, of course, that would be now like where Frodo has to finally, face Mount Doom and throw the ring, and then the ring ends up like hypnotizing him, and he's like, the ring is mine. Like that was like a climax, because by the time the ring takes Frodo over and he wears it and the eye turns and Aragorn and company are fighting at the gate, by the time that's happening, it's like there's so much tension because of all the build-up. Now here in this show, where is all the tension? It's not there, because you didn't do the other three things that I talked about. There is no tension, there is no setup, therefore there is no knockout, there is no final outcome. By the time they are doing a final outcome, yes, I know you're going to be like, oh, in episode 6 there's a huge war, but I have to like episode 1 to 5 before I like episode 6. You get, that's the issue. Personally, I tried watching episode 4 to try and just make content, and I fell asleep. It was so bad. Episode 4 to me was so bad. Galadriel is so unlikable. Yeah, and oh my god. Anyway, that is just, there was a time I used to try writing novels, so I have a bit of writing knowledge, and I'm like, the writing standard is so low for this show. You can't even say that it's Lord of the Rings. You'd say maybe it's like fan fiction, childish Game of Thrones. That would make more sense. If this show did not have the Lord of the Rings brand IP, then fine, maybe you can be like, oh yeah, this show is a bit acceptable. But because it comes from a legendary fantasy novel, it's just low tier. It's low tier fan fiction, and that's why it sucks. It sucks so bad.